Hello, listeners. This talk is about Donald Trump. In many ways, it's a follow-up to a similar talk I did, I believe it was near the end of last year, about Donald Trump, in which I discussed various scenarios or possible scenarios and what I thought they would mean and which scenarios I thought would be better or worse than others. Originally in that talk, I said that I would have liked it if Trump had been the clear leader, but if he had been martyred by the GOP establishment, stealing the nomination from him at the convention and then appointing some sort of cuck as the Republican candidate for the presidential election in November of this year. Of course, in that event, I believe the cuck would have been slaughtered at the presidential election, and that would have allowed Hillary to run amok. And the intention behind all of that was that by her running amok, because of demographic issues that are looming in the next decade or so, things need to be brought to a head fairly quickly. So I believe that by her running amok, that would have accelerated a program of red-pilling the American populace to eventually take, how would we describe it, non-electoral courses of action, shall we say. Now that hasn't happened. Events this week, basically Trump winning an absolutely resounding victory in Indiana, have ruled that out because both Cruz and Kasich dropped out, leaving him as the only remaining person in the primary chase for 1237, and he'll basically get that number now unopposed. So he is pretty much he's going to be the candidate for the Republican Party. And therefore that sort of accelerationist program is not quite open as it was. It's still somewhat open, but not exactly in the same way. I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen now. I think that at some level the GOP establishment are going to try to tame Donald Trump in some way. They're going to try to move him over to their positions. Some people, of course, have thrown rather amusing public hissy fits, burning their membership cards and all of this sort of stuff. But I think there are some cunning people in the GOP establishment who are coming to terms with this, and they may have already been preparing for this for some time now, given that Donald Trump has been in the lead for a long time now, particularly with the recent victories in New York and the 5 northeastern states that he won recently also. I think some people have probably been preparing for this, and they're going to try to co-opt him in some way. Now, to what extent do I think that's likely? I really don't know. I mean, I think he will. He seems to have been trying to appear more presidential and all of that sort of stuff recently, and sort of toning things down a little bit. So maybe he'll go a little bit in that direction. Who knows? Before I get into really discussing Trump and the general election as I see things evolving from now until then with Hillary, I want to briefly discuss a couple of very important geopolitical events that I think have a fairly high likelihood. I'm not saying they're certain, but I think there's a fairly high likelihood of these two things occurring during the next term, regardless of whether it's Trump or Clinton in there. I think these two things have a very high possibility of occurring. And I think they're going to be very important for the whole world. They're going to be important for America, and they're also going to be important for the person who is leading America if these things occur. So the first one is that I think there is a fairly high likelihood of some sort of economic crisis, recession, or maybe even a full-blown depression within the next few years. Now, why do I think this? I'm not going to throw a whole lot of figures at you, but basically, by the time the next president is inaugurated in the USA, it will have been approximately a decade, almost a decade, just under, since the last recession. Now, recessions occur on average approximately once every 7 years. Of course, they don't fall exactly on the 7-year mark, but they'll be overdue for a recession. And there seem to be a lot of potential problems all around the world at the moment. It's hard to find a major player which doesn't have all sorts of problems. The US, various European countries, and the EU as a whole, China, Japan, you name it. There are bubbles everywhere. There's a massive amount of debt everywhere. All of these problems, many countries are slowing down in their growth, all sorts of things. So there seems to be a lot of kindling lying around on the forest floor at the moment, and it's probably not going to take very much for that to go off. And because of the way in which everything is interconnected, when it goes off in one place, it's going to ripple throughout most of the world. Further to this, a lot of people, both in the US and elsewhere, particularly in some southern European nations, have not recovered from the last recession. So they're already down on their knees, and there's a big blow that's coming to them, and it's going to do a lot more damage than the last one did. So I think that the next one that comes, when it comes, is likely to be far worse than the last one, both in terms of magnitude, the size of it, because there's just so much more debt now than there was before, and also how it will actually affect people, because, as I said, a lot of people haven't recovered yet, and many of them never will, from the last economic crisis. So whether it's Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, the next president is going to have to deal with all of that. And it's, the last one had serious ramifications in terms of policy and so on. Pardon me, I still have this cough. The second event that I think is likely, or reasonably likely, in the next few years is that I think there is going to be some sort of civil strife in Europe. It just seems like things are moving so quickly there that it's going to be a miracle if something doesn't happen within the next few years, within the next 4 years, say, of the first term or the next term of whoever gets elected president in the US. Firstly, Sweden and Germany are basically done within the next decade if something doesn't happen. If things continue as they are now, just sort of rolling along, getting progressively worse, but if there's no sort of major reaction to that, those two countries at least, possibly some others, are pretty much done within the next decade, simply because the German youth and the Swedish youth will be in the minority compared to non-Germans and non-Swedes in their countries. I think many of you have probably seen that video that was made by Black Pigeon about Germany. They're going to be in real trouble in the next few years if something doesn't happen. That doesn't mean they're completely out for the count, because they could, even if the youth were in the minority, maybe they could fight back, maybe other countries would help them. But I think in all seriousness, they're probably done unless someone else steps in and helps them. If nothing happens within the next few years, they can't continue on the course they're on. Likewise, I think that this year, well, we're already seeing it, the numbers of refugees have increased compared to the same time period last year. And this summer is just going to be an absolute blockbuster. It's going to be like some sort of Michael Bay film. I mean, it's going to be insane this summer. There's going to be an absolute flood. The flood this year is going to make last year's flood look like a trickle. There's going to be more sort of general mayhem, women getting touched up in public, general sort of low-level petty crime, stealing, burning, trashing things, all of that stuff. And of course, as we've seen over the past couple of years, there's been some sort of terrorist incident more or less every month. Those are going to continue this year. We're going to see more of them this year for sure, and next year, and the year after, and so on. That's kind of the new normal in Europe at this point. And all of this is just going to keep adding more and more tinder to the floor of the forest. Of course, Brussels, and by Brussels I mean the EU technocrats, and their regional representatives and so on. In fact, London is going to end up with its first Mohammedan mayor. The race basically came down to a Mohammedan or a Jew, not a Briton, an Englishman, and that's just, you know, that's going to continue, that kind of stuff. But basically, all of these people, Brussels and their cronies in major European cities, all of the globalists, all of these people, they're going to continue to try to prevent the right from rising. They're going to try to keep the natural reaction down. They may succeed to some extent electorally. I don't know. There's the second round of the Austrian presidential election is later this month, I believe the 22nd of May, and it's looking neck and neck at this point between the I think it's the Freedom Party, their candidate. They're the right-wing party, not centre-right, but really right-wing party, and an independent supported by the Greens. It's looking pretty neck and neck. They may indeed keep that down. They may indeed keep Brexit down, which is next month at the end of June, I think the 23rd. They may do that. Eventually, I think someone will break through somewhere. I don't know where or who it will be, but I think someone will break through. I mean, I know already there are a couple of right-wing governments in Eastern Europe, Poland and Hungary at least, but I'm really talking about Western Europe here. Someone will break through, and the globalists in Brussels and on the other side of the Atlantic as well, they will try to keep this down, and they will succeed to some extent. But with this flood, this invasion that is descending upon Europe, has been for several years now, with that just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and of course the people causing more and more trouble and terrorist incidents and all of this sort of stuff, the globalists are going to have trouble containing the narrative, and sort of, you know, it's going to be whack-a-mole for them, both in terms of dealing with the terrorist incidents and things like Cologne, those kinds of things, and at the same time right-wing groups that will be popping up all over the place. And I think eventually they'll lose control of that, and in some way we'll see a kind of a reprise of the 1930s. During that time it was communists and Nazis battling it out on the streets. This time it will be Mohammedans and patriots of various descriptions, European patriots, battling it out on the streets. And there'll be, you know, one group will do one thing, and then there'll be a tit-for-tat response, and back and forth it will rage. The government will try somewhat successfully to keep things under control for a while, and then, you know, they will increasingly lose control of all of that. And I think that all of that will be exacerbated by economic issues, because several European countries are really teetering on the edge of complete economic collapse, and others aren't that far behind them even. So those are two things that I think are going to be a backdrop to whatever happens everywhere else in the world, including the US, in the next 4 years, or 4 to 8 years, but particularly the next 4 years. So now I'd like to actually talk about Trump and re-examine some of these scenarios I discussed in the previous video. So let's begin by looking at the situation of Trump winning the general election in November. So firstly, what could he achieve? Well, in all likelihood, he would be able to appoint several Supreme Court justices. That's one thing that I think liberals in particular are going to be very scared about, because they're worried that the sort of balance, the political balance of the Supreme Court will shift dramatically to the right. In particular, I think they'd be very concerned about Roe versus Wade, which is basically about whether abortion is legal or not. Because if the Supreme Court ends up being conservative, then Roe versus Wade could actually come under attack. Now, will these Supreme Court justices that Trump would get to appoint be liberal or conservative? Would they even tackle Roe versus Wade? Would he want them to? I don't really know about all of that. I mean, he's definitely not a sort of Christian conservative evangelical type of Republican. He's definitely not that. Maybe he would appoint those kinds of people. I really don't know. Would he shift the Overton window in that regard? Would he want to? I actually don't know. It's a bit hard to tell with him. I don't really think that's that important in a way, or at least it's not as important as certain other issues. Would he build a wall? Would he stop immigration? Would he deport people? That's a big one of his. Firstly, I don't know whether he could actually achieve those things or not. I suspect that he wouldn't be able to do as much as many on the alt-right would hope, simply because I think he'll be opposed at every opportunity by liberals. They will try very hard to thwart him. If necessary, they will just block him with every petty bureaucrat, every teacher, every person who works in every government department will sort of try to throw sand in his gears. And they might well succeed at that. I don't know. Part of the trouble with all of this is that to really win this culture war, the cathedral needs to be completely cleaned out. It's sort of like dealing with a weed infestation or cancer or something. If you don't get all of it, it's going to grow back. Is he that fashy though? Would he actually do that? Clean out any left-wing bureaucracy? Probably not. And also, I don't think the nation is quite at that point yet where they would fully support him. Congress probably wouldn't. The Supreme Court probably wouldn't. So I don't think he would do that, even if he wanted to, and it's not clear to me that he would. It may just be that a lot of these things that he has said are kind of the standard negotiating tactic of pushing for more than you really want. So you push very hard to one end, hoping that your opponents will meet you in the middle. So the farther out you are to one end, the more they have to move towards what now becomes the middle. I suspect that that's what he's kind of doing, and I suspect that he won't really go full alt-right on all of this, and I think people will be somewhat disappointed. It's hard to say though. I don't really know. But as I mentioned, I think liberals will try very hard to thwart him at every opportunity, regardless of what he does, regardless of whether he's really right out on the right or just a little bit out on the right. They will oppose him, of course. Pardon me. Now that could actually be a good thing in some sense if he is blocked. If normies see that liberals are being very unreasonable, that the game is rigged, they could actually get red-pilled from that. And the more ridiculous liberals are in openly thwarting him, the better, actually. Because and things like riots would be fantastic, because that kind of stuff would really red pill a lot of people, I think. So hopefully that would all backfire on liberals when they do it, because it's not a matter of if. They will definitely oppose him if he becomes the president. They will oppose him on every single thing. All of the sort of obstructionist labels they've thrown at Republicans over Obama's administration, they will engage in all of that stuff times 100 against Trump, for sure. So hopefully that would really backfire. If he couldn't get what he wanted to get done, and if he were only pushing for something halfway where those of us on the alt-right would like it to be. It might actually be better if he got thwarted in only sort of going halfway rather than kind of get away with doing a bit of stuff, because that wouldn't really shift the Overton window too much, whereas this thwarting of even the smallest thing might really backfire on Liberals. I don't know, but I think that's the case. I suspect that Trump is going to be a kind of John the Baptist figure in many regards. I think he's unlikely to really fash out and really score major hits against Liberals in the culture war. He's not going to just go in and clean out UC Berkeley. He's not going to do that, right? He's not going to go into the education department and clean that out. That's not going to happen. I really don't think that's going to happen. But he may sort of shift the Overton window enough that that could be a possibility in his next term or in someone else's term after that, and so on and so forth. If he doesn't score major victories in the culture war, I mean, Liberals, they're going to oppose him no matter what, right? As I've already mentioned. I think we could then be looking at a major counter-push from the left in 2020 or 2024, sort of a la what happened with Barack Obama being elected after George Bush. George Bush was the devil, and there was this jubilation. I mean, remember all the just insanity. Obama got the Nobel Peace Prize. I can't remember how long he'd been in for at that point, but he got the Nobel Peace Prize, and then of course he ended up just completely destroying the Middle East after that. The so-called Arab Spring and ISIS and all this stuff that's happened since then. I mean, what a joke, right? But I remember at the time, people really did think it was like the second coming. I worked with a black woman at the time. I worked with a number of black people at the time, actually, here in Taiwan. And I think it was about 4 months into his presidency, and this black woman, I mean, she was ecstatic on the day when he got elected. She just out of the blue one day, she just turned to me in the office. It was an open plan office. She just swiveled around on her chair and said, she was just effervescent. She just said to me, I think they should let him run for a third term. This was 4 months into his first term. That was the feeling. And I remember being here in Taiwan, and, I'm not even American, right? But I had all these random Taiwanese people coming up to me, I guess just because I'm white. I mean, I'm not American. Even if I were, how would they know who I voted for if I voted, all of that? But I just had all these random Taiwanese people coming up to me saying, yes, we can. And I was just like, okay, whatever. There was that feeling, and, because it was like, oh God, thank God George Bush is gone. Oh, there was this sort of international sigh of relief when Bush was gone, and, Barack Obama was going to be like Jesus and Gandhi and, God, Mother Teresa and all of these other, and Nelson Mandela and all of these other people rolled into one, right? Of course, he was never going to be that at best, and of course, he's been a complete disaster. But nevertheless, I think if Trump doesn't do something to change the Overton window and the culture war and all of that sort of stuff, I mean, they'll still paint him as the devil, and there could be a real sort of pushback, because, the cathedral, they always know that there's more than one way to skin a cat. So even if they lose an election, they don't really lose an election. And then, of course, when they win the next election, then they accelerate a whole lot of their policies very quickly, as we have seen under Obama. Now, that's a really black pill. I'm actually trying to be more optimistic in this talk than I would normally be. Maybe it doesn't sound like it so far, but I am actually trying to be optimistic here. Because I think if they went down that route, the US would probably enter a kind of a death spiral under that scenario, like what I think Europe is likely to experience fairly soon. Europe will be slightly ahead of the US, but if they get whatever the follow-up to Obama is, assuming Clinton doesn't get there, whatever the follow-up is in 2020 or 2024, it's that's going to lead America on a cultural war death spiral, essentially, if that happens. Now, under that kind of scenario, in a trade-off. It would be a trade-off between preparation and demographics, and this is where it gets really interesting, I think, because the longer this goes on, the worse the demographics are likely to become. So 4 years from now, 8 years from now, because I don't think that Trump is going to sort of run Operation Wetback Mark 2. I don't think that's going to happen. I think what's likely to happen is, I don't know whether he'll build a wall or not, but I think he will probably slow illegal immigration to some extent, but he's not going to round everyone who's already there up and kick them out. And in that case, the demographics are going to be worse the longer these things go on, because there are more of them who are breeding faster than white people on the right. Between white people on the left and everyone else on the left, they're just going to outbreed the white people on the right. Now, that's not an end game scenario, but it's still pretty bad. So that's the negative situation, demographics. If pardon me, if these things continue, right? If there's a sort of a left-wing pushback and they manage to take the White House in 2020 or 2024, the demographics are going to be really bad. After that, by the time you get to the 30s, things are going to be pretty grim. However, of course, the potential positive is that if Trump can do things, he might be able to put in certain policies that would aid the alt-right in terms of preparation for when the real show starts. It may be that they can recruit more people, they can harness more resources and all of this sort of stuff. I don't know, that's an interesting trade-off. The longer things go on, the more time people have to prepare for what's coming, but of course the longer things go on, the more enemies there are going to be. But having just gone through all of that, I think that all of that really ignores the two looming geopolitical issues I mentioned at sort of near the start of this talk. Firstly, I think if there were a major recession or even a depression, then I think the USA would probably become a lot more nationalistic. I think it would take several steps to the right. So maybe it wouldn't necessarily be bad for Donald Trump to preside over that, though I would prefer that he didn't in a way. Now, the reason for this, the reason why the USA would likely become more nationalistic is, firstly, I think the citizenry wouldn't really be in any kind of mood for another bank bailout. I think Wall Street was actually pretty lucky, pretty good at pulling off the last one. I think people are onto them though, and I think there's a lot of resentment, both on the left and the right, hence the popularity also of Bernie Sanders. I don't think another bailout would fly, to be honest. I think the globalists would really be pushing their luck. They'd really be on the nose, and I don't think they'd get away with it, to be honest. So people are not going to go in for the globalists. I think globalism in the next few years is probably going to reach its high water mark and then fall when it probably with the next economic crisis. Also, people just wouldn't be in the mood for refugees, refugees, illegal immigrants, or anyone else who they would perceive as being an economic threat to them. They would just be saying, well, things are pretty tough for us. We don't have enough to spread around those who are already here, who are working, who have worked, maybe they're out of work now, but who have worked and all of this sort of stuff. We don't have gibs for strangers, essentially. Also, I think they would expect law and order against Hindus. I don't think, a bunch of white guys who have maybe lost their jobs and are in the process of losing their houses, they're not going to be particularly amenable to Hindu riots and that sort of stuff. And, all of this Black Lives Matter nonsense that's been occurring over the past, whatever it is, couple of years. Plus, also, I think there'd be calls for a clampdown upon welfare for Hindus. Not the kind of welfare for, some white guy who's worked all of his life and now he's lost his job and he thinks, well, I've paid into the system, now I want the government to where's that safety net, right? But not that sort of welfare, but I think there would be calls to clamp down upon people who have never worked and who are a complete drain upon the system. And Hindus are overwhelmingly represented amongst those ranks. So I think people would start getting rather tired of that. And I think that all of this could possibly be managed into some sort of general rightward shift, in an alt-right sense here, not a sort of a neo-Cohen or globalist Wall Street type of, rightward in perhaps in parentheses, rightward shift, but really kind of an alt-right sense, though it could also be managed by the left towards their kind of socialism. That's the danger. If Donald Trump sort of gets this wrong, in 2020, someone, Bernie Sanders Mark II, could kind of ride in on that wave. So in this regard, I think it will be important if Trump is the president and he's in the White House when an economic crisis hits, that he makes very certain that the GOP establishment, as it currently exists, does not have that much influence, so that they wouldn't be able to really try to bail out Wall Street and all of that sort of stuff. So he wouldn't get tarred with this with the same brush, essentially. One of the most important things that needs to come of this election, regardless of whether Donald Trump wins or loses in the general election, is that the GOP establishment need to be destroyed, at least severely weakened, but ideally destroyed, and replaced as by something else. The Republican Party or something needs to emerge that's a complete change of course to the current Republican Party, whether that's within the Republican Party or outside of the Republican Party. But the GOP establishment, they need to be destroyed this election cycle. I think that's one of the most crucial things, regardless of who wins. Now, on the issue of Europe and the likelihood of Europe descending into civil strife and disorder, I think that Trump would be very good for Europe in a number of ways. Firstly, I think that if he were the president, he would likely de-escalate things with Putin, thus allowing nationalism, as exemplified by Putin in a way, and people like Viktor Orban and those kinds of figures, that would allow nationalism to come off at least as not having lost, if not as winning. So that de-escalation would allow some breathing space for the idea of nationalism within Europe. I think that secondly, I think that Trump would not be a major supporter of the EU and Brussels. I mean, of course, he'd still have to interact with them and so on and so forth. There'd still have to be international diplomacy, but he would not be like Obama. Obama currently, he's a cheerleader for all of that, because the EU, Brussels, Obama, they're all part of that globalist agenda, right? So of course he's a cheerleader for those guys. We can see this right now. I mean, he recently appeared with David Cameron. He's trying to influence Brexit, essentially. So again, I don't think Trump would go in for all that. I mean, he's made comments already. He's been critical already of the invasion of Europe. He made comments about Brussels, and Mohammedanism and all of this sort of stuff. And his recent foreign policy speech was really interesting. I mean, the interesting thing about that, first of all, aside from all the what he said, was just the fact that he said it. He wasn't actually really sort of super rah-rah fashy, but it's a bit like it's that first day in summer, or that first really hot day in spring. At some point in spring, you have sort of cold weather and you think you're just sort of at the tail end of winter, and then there's just this one hot day, and then you have a few more cold days after that. You have this one hot day and everyone's like, wow, the hot weather's here. It's a bit like that because we're so used to hearing and seeing completely cucked foreign policy from leaders of the US that when someone even comes out with something that's just slightly to the right of that, everyone's like, wow, what's going on? And, that and his comments on Brussels and some other comments as well seem to me to suggest that he would at least withdraw pressure. He wouldn't be a cheerleader for the EU and globalism and all of this sort of stuff. And that would just remove a little bit of pressure. I mean, of course, European affairs are still going to be European affairs. And the Brussels technocrats, even without the support of Donald Trump, they're still going to keep doing what they're doing now. But they would just lose a little bit of that support. And the nationalists in Europe would get a little bit of breathing space. And at some level, they'd also be given a sort of a tacit green light. Or they would interpret it that way. If strife does end up beginning in Europe, I don't think Trump would be very likely to directly intervene. I mean, he's not going to send troops there and that kind of thing, right? Unless things really escalated and they started really getting out of control. But even then, he might not. So, one way or another, he's not. I don't think he would aid the alt-right in Europe. I don't think he would hinder them either. I think he would likely just remain an observer. But he would, at some level, he would probably let Brussels know that they wouldn't have it entirely their own way, simply because he wouldn't support them. He wouldn't back them up. So, that would be crucial for European patriots in dealing with both the invaders and the treasonous elites in Europe. That might be the breathing space they need. Just having the US president essentially not back the treasonous elites, just having the US president not backing the genocide of European people and their cultures. And if that were the case, the Euro, the EU, these things might not survive. If several nations in Europe knew that they could withdraw from either the Euro or the EU and not have both Brussels and Washington on their backs playing tag team, if they knew that they would only have to contend with one, that might embolden some of them, and it might cause some of them to start giving serious consideration to leaving, either the EU or the Euro, or both. I think that under that scenario, it's quite possible. I don't know how possible, but I think there's a reasonable chance that at least one Western European nation could take a sharp turn to the right. Likewise, Greece. I think Greece, they're right in the firing line, both in terms of being the entry point for a lot of these invaders, and also for economic reasons. I mean, they're really in big trouble. So they could take a sharp turn to the right. I also imagine that there's a fairly high chance that the Visegrad group, those are Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary. They're sort of in a kind of a little group there, a political group. They have been since, I believe, 1991. I believe that there could be serious pushback from them against Brussels, and maybe they would even open up a fault line in the EU that would eventually tear the EU apart. They might end up exiting the EU or cause other nations to exit the EU and so on. It could get really interesting there if those countries thought that they might have, say, Putin on backing them up. Although that's complicated because that they also frequently have no love for Russia and all of their memories of the Soviet Union dominating them during the Cold War and so on. But certainly, if they thought that the US president weren't opposing them, things could get very interesting there. So I think that change in regard to Europe would likely be on a par with destroying the GOP establishment in terms of the importance and also the likelihood or the practicality or all of that sort of stuff of what Donald Trump could actually really achieve in the White House. I think that's a really important thing for the alt-right, the preservation and survival of Europe. And Donald Trump would not be actively adding to the destruction of Europe. And that alone, just taking that pressure off, might be enough. And that and destroying the GOP establishment, I believe, are the two most important things that he could really achieve. I mean, of course, building a wall, Operation Wetback Mark II, I don't think that's going to happen that much. I think he's more likely to be able to help Europe and also destroy the GOP establishment. Now, Donald Trump, he may not directly achieve much that is fascist, certainly within the US, but he may be the precursor to such things. He might be the person who allows the real right, the alt-right space to actually grow, both within the US and abroad, simply because he would change the entire tone of geopolitics. Having said all of that, let's now imagine that he goes on to lose the election against Hillary Clinton at the end of this year. So what would that mean? Well, I think that as per previous comments I have made, both within this talk and the previous talk I made, I think that Hillary would almost certainly red pill an enormous number of people. I mean, she would be terrible. She would be insane. She would just be the worst nightmare for a lot of people, even a lot of people who wouldn't imagine that now. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people. Well, I know there are a lot of people because I've spoken to quite a few on the alt-right who were Obama voters and quite enthusiastically so, and now they're edgelords on the internet. I think she would have that effect as well. However, that scenario is not optimal because it would do a lot of damage to the right also. That she wouldn't have been able to do if he had been martyred by the GOP establishment. So I believe it would not be such a good thing, actually, if she were to defeat him. But, of course, she would have to deal with a major economic crisis, I believe. I think there's a high likelihood of that. Whomever is in there will probably have to deal with an economic crisis. And I think that she just wouldn't be able to help herself in bailing out the banks and all of that stuff. Those people are her buddies, they're her donors, all of that sort of stuff. She's on board with their agenda. She just wouldn't. There's no way she would not do that. She'd have all of these excuses, all the excuses they used last time. I don't think those excuses would fly. And I think a lot more people, even people who were on the left, would get very upset about that. So who knows, as a kind of a weird long shot, she might actually really pave the way for someone even fascier than Donald Trump. In some strange scenario, she might actually be better than him because she might really upset people to the point where the next time around they get someone even more to the right than Donald Trump. Also, I think that Hillary Clinton would likely continue to screw up international relations. I mean, she did a fantastic job of that when she was Secretary of State. I think that she would it's who knows the kind of untold damage that she would inflict around the world. The US would lose a lot of diplomatic currency, I think. She just wouldn't be able to resist entangling the US in something pretty unproductive and damaging, or at least just sort of laying waste to whole countries from afar, or provoking ISIS to open new chapters in new countries and all of this sort of stuff. There'd be a big backlash. I mean, the so-called Arab Spring. Remember how that was going to be this wonderful thing, and now it's not, and now there's ISIS. With her actually as the president, at the top of the totem pole, not number 2 or 3 or whatever on the totem pole, the damage that she could do would be even greater, and I think that she would do that damage. So that could usher in all sorts of interesting reactions, but who knows? Now, bad points of Hillary becoming the president instead of Donald Trump. I think, and I think this would be correct at some level, that Hillary's victory would be seen as a repudiation of the alt-right. People would say, well, all of you fashy, angry white guys out there, you lost fair and square. The country actually doesn't like you, and they don't like what you want, and all of that sort of stuff. And I think that would be quite accurate, actually. They'd have the numbers on their side. Now, maybe they would have got there dishonestly, but nevertheless, they'd still have the numbers on their side. And of course, Hillary would then claim that she had a mandate for what would follow. And to some extent she would, though she would shock a lot of people in the same way that Barack Obama shocked a lot of people. A lot of people thought that he was going to be Jesus and Gandhi and Mandela and Mother Teresa and all of these other people rolled into one. And I guess in some ways he was, because Mandela destroyed South Africa also. But a lot of people were shocked at how things actually turned out. I mean, remember, he was meant to introduce America into a kind of post-racial way of thinking, and race relations are at their lowest ebb in 50 years in the US. Well, she would do all of that and more. But nevertheless, she would get in claiming she had a mandate. But she would red pill some people. But I think, oddly, many people would still only be semi-red pilled. It's weird. But I think many people would still only be semi-red pilled because they'd say, well, she won the election fair and square. You'd have all these cucks on the right, supposedly on the right, who would say that as well. Oh, well, she did win fair and square. And somehow people would blame that on Trump. So I think that would be worse than the scenario I previously wanted, with Trump getting martyred by the GOP establishment. And this actually leads me on to talking about them. I think that Trump losing, rather than helping to destroy the GOP establishment, I mean, it would unleash chaos in their midst for a while, but I think actually it would be bad, because it would allow them to have another chance. They would say, we told you so. We told you Trump was going to be a disaster. We were going to lose, and he was going to give you Hillary. We told you that was going to happen. It happened. You didn't listen to us. Now listen to us this time. You don't want a repeat of that. You don't want her to have 8 years instead of 4 years. And at some level, that would revitalize the GOP establishment. A lot of people would be suckered by that, and they would go along with it. And of course, their cardboard cuckout, maybe he would win in 2020, maybe. It wouldn't do anything, of course, because that's the whole point of him being a cardboard cuckout for the GOP establishment, that he's not going to do anything significant. At best, he'll slow the decline, but he certainly won't turn it around. So that's what would happen. But of course, they would still blame everything on Trump, and the GOP establishment would get a new lease of life in 2020. And that would be very, 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 very bad. The GOP establishment needs to be destroyed. The GOP needs to take a complete turn in another direction. If that doesn't happen, if there's some cardboard cuckout in 2020 or possibly beyond, though I think the demographics would make it harder and harder for that to be the case in the 2020s and certainly the 2030s. If they get a new lease of life, it's going to be a disaster. They need to be destroyed. Also, I think the morale of people on the right, on the alt-right, would take a real beating if Trump were to lose. And some of those people might sort of retreat into neatdom, playing video games and looking at anime and so on. I think the people who would be really badly affected, though, would be the normies who have got on the Trump train. Maybe they're not full alt-right, but they've sort of got on the Trump train. I think those people would be devastated. They would probably switch off. A lot of those people have been switched off for years, or they've never been involved in politics. And Trump coming along has kind of enlivened them. I think a lot of those people would retreat into self-destructive things, drugs, video games, anime, all of that sort of stuff. Or they might just try to hunker down and just try to get by. But I think it would be really disastrous for the morale of a lot of people, including on the alt-right, but not limited to the alt-right. Now, of course, eventually there might be more red pilling, but the break in momentum for the alt-right, coupled with a resurgent GOP establishment and their sort of the way they would hoodwink a lot of people, and the demographic changes that are coming along, might make the eventual storm that much harder to weather. I mean, it would come eventually. The crisis would come. I don't think things can continue as they are now. But of course, several election cycles down the road, things would be a lot grimmer. And it might be a lot harder to win at that point, whether through the electoral process or not. Also, I think Hillary Clinton would be an absolute disaster for Europe. She would be atrocious. Brussels would know that it had the unequivocal support of Washington in its ongoing auto-genocide of Europeans and their culture. Those, how do I describe these people? Those evil motherfuckers in Brussels, they would know that both sides of the Atlantic were fully on board the project of destroying Europe at that point, and they would embrace that support with glee and with a new fervor. Now, that wouldn't make it impossible for Europeans, but it would certainly make things a lot harder and a lot bloodier, I believe. I wouldn't even put it past Hillary to directly intervene in Europe. Maybe only with a small military presence, but politically and also maybe even economically, I don't know, but I really wouldn't put it past her to intervene in Europe if it looked like a country or two were going to fasci. I mean, there'd be boycotts. At the least, there'd be boycotts. It might not end there. And of course, I think there'd be confrontation with Putin, and that's the last thing we need: a US-Russia war or a series of proxy wars. I mean, we've already got a couple going, but we don't need more of all of that stuff. I think anything would be on the table with Hillary and her supporters, because she's crazy and they're crazy. And she's evil and they're evil. Trump's defeat would also be a major blow in terms of morale to Europe and Europeans. I'm talking about the patriotic Europeans here. As many there also look to him, I think at some level, many people there look to him as sort of one of the three knights in shining armor. The others being Marine Le Pen and Vladimir Putin, to one degree or another. And if they lost one of their knights, essentially, Putin's kind of, there's some support from this other people don't like him, Le Pen would be the remaining hope. She would be the remaining knight in shining armor for Europe in many people's minds. So, there would be a real blow to their morale if Hillary were to beat Trump. I think a lot of people in Europe are really hoping that she does, but I think there are a lot of people who are really hoping that Trump wins. So on balance, I think that Hillary Clinton defeating Donald Trump would be a negative thing. Previously, I've said that I wanted her to win, but only if Trump were martyred. I think in this scenario of Hillary Clinton defeating Donald Trump in the presidential election, the net effect would be quite negative, even taking into account all of that accelerationism and so on. And this is why I said earlier that I'm trying to be more kind of optimistic about this, because I do actually want him to win here now. And I am getting more and more on board the Trump train myself. If it were only the US, then I might sort of go the other way and say that although it would be ugly, the US could weather one or two terms of Hillary, and there'd be enough of a reaction after her to really bring in the kind of Jesus figure to Donald Trump's John the Baptist. But I think that Europe is going to be in real trouble in the next few years, and even just 4 years of Hillary, let alone 8, could make that much harder for Europe. So, as I said earlier, aside from destroying the GOP establishment, I think Donald Trump's probably greatest achievement will be to indirectly save Europe, or contribute to it being saved, to give it breathing space, essentially. Because you're not going to see any photo ops of him with champagne glasses laughing with Angela Merkel, right? It's not going to be like that, or at least I hope it's not, if he does become the president of the USA. So I'm going to sort of start wrapping up now. I don't think that Donald Trump will achieve all that people hope that he will achieve on specific policies, particularly domestic policies, though he might. I hope that he does, though I really don't think he would go far enough. And I think that you need someone who's going to go the whole hog. I think in this regard, he will, in some ways, he'll end up like Obama, in that, there were these high hopes for Obama, and a lot of people on the left have been disappointed by Obama. So many people on the left say that he didn't go far enough. I think that many people on the right will think that Donald Trump didn't go far enough when they look back at the end of his first or second term, because I don't think he'll go full fash. And I think also the Congress and the Supreme Court, and of course all of the bureaucracy and all of this other stuff, will try to rein him in somewhat. I mean, that's even if he really does want to go full fash, which I don't think he does. But as I mentioned earlier, I think his real value is actually threefold. Firstly, the GOP establishment needs to be beaten down. I've said this several times, but I really can't say this enough. They need to be severely beaten down, if not destroyed. The very nature of the Republican Party needs to be changed. It needs to move away from being a globalist party towards a nationalist party, something that is truly for America. Even if that's going to be a painful and rocky process, and it likely would be. But nevertheless, the neo-Cohens and the guys who make a lot of money from globalization and all of this outsourcing or bringing in cheap labor, they need to be expelled, or they need to leave of their own accord. And it needs to be seen as fashionable to be fashy to be fashy, in putting America, and by extension the West, first. All that kind of stuff that Donald Trump said in his recent foreign policy speech. America needs to be first, and by extension the West needs to be first, whether on domestic or foreign policy. As I said, I don't think he'll get all of that through, but he needs to change the tone. At the very least, there needs to be a social stigma, if not legal and financial penalties, though I don't think that those would come. But I think there needs to at least be a social stigma for employing illegal immigrants, for being a dindu who collects welfare and rights, and for being an SJW troublemaker. All of those people need to be shamed. They need to know that they're on the back foot from now on. That's the first thing he needs to do. Secondly, Brussels needs to be spurned as well as you can in international diplomacy. I mean, he's not going to just sort of close all of the American embassies in Europe and tell them where to go, right? But Brussels and the people in Brussels need to be spurned. And European patriots need to know that at least the US is not actively cheering their genocide. Even if it doesn't get directly involved in supporting them, they just need to know that not everyone in the world hates them and wants to see them dead. Europe needs space to survive and to prepare its own pushback, which is coming. I mean, I'll be really surprised if that doesn't happen in the next 10 years, if not the next 5 years. So they need some space there, because that's coming. And thirdly, in general, I think Trump just needs to pave the way for something bigger and better than him, something beyond him. He needs to shift the entire conversation. I mean, he's already done that a lot, but there's still more that needs to be done in that regard. He needs to move the Overton window. He needs to make it okay for people to speak out against a lot of the crazy stuff that's been happening for the past few years. He needs to change the tone of the conversation, even more than he has already. Not just for America, but for the rest of the West and even the rest of the world. Mostly this will be psychological. I don't think he'll get a lot of very specific policies through. He may, but they won't necessarily be that strong if he goes on to get elected. And really, I don't know whether he will or not. It's hard to know who to believe in all of this. I actually haven't discussed that because I really don't know. But, he needs to start with the psychological. He's already done a lot, but there's more to be done. The men of the West are ready. The real men of the West, and it doesn't have to be every man in the West. It only has to be a small group. It can't be too small, but a small group to really do things. They're ready. They just need some leadership, or they just need someone to let them know that it's okay, to inspire them. Even if Trump is not our Flavius Isis or our Charles Martel or our Don John or our Jan Sobieski, even if he's not those people, those four people, if you don't know who they are, Flavius Isis basically brought the invasion of Attila the Hun sort of to a standstill at the Battle of the Catalaunian Fields. Charles Martel defeated a Mohammedan invasion of France in, when was it, 723, I believe. Don John, he was the leader of the forces at the Battle of Lepanto, and Jan Sobieski was the Polish king who basically saved Vienna from the Turks in 1683. Even if he's not one of those guys, Flavius Isis, Charles Martel, Don John, Jan Sobieski, he can and should be the new herald of the next one of those guys. Even if he's the unwitting herald, he needs to be the herald of the next Flavius Isis, or the next Charles Martel, the next Don John, or the next Jan Sobieski. That's what we can really hope for from Donald Trump. If he doesn't get elected, then we're all going to have to take a pretty big dose of the black pill and prepare for things to get very interesting under Hillary Clinton and the ensuing backlash after her. But maybe I'm becoming more naive, or I've sort of drunk the Kool-Aid or something, but I feel like maybe we don't quite have to go there. Maybe I'm a bit more optimistic than I was a few months ago. I don't know. Anyway, hopefully this has sort of lifted your moods. I'm sure many of you have already been quite ecstatic this week over Trump winning in Indiana and the other two dropping out. But let me know in the comments beneath this video. And as always, thank you for listening.